I seldom called Cliff. For decades, Amy Jackson, I hope you're here, can confirm I just pop in. If Cliff were there, we'd talk. If away, I'd try another day. Ringing Cliff up was tough because his hello, if that's what he muttered, suggested, what do you want? A call-me chit-chatter, fidgety Cliff was not. The guy was incapable of aiming his voice into anything phonic, tele or micro. And not just New Jersey microphones or British or Moroccan microphones. I personally ear-witnessed Cliff on 5 continents, all save South America and Antarctica. Any microphone escaped Cliff, whether speaking Indonesian into one in Java or American into one in Canberra. And who can forget San Francisco 1982, Cliff intoning to a vast and various horde of anthropologists, some smiling, some scowling, anti-relativism. So here's the mic. But there are Cliff's muses, often up to the right, out to the left, down, in the ceiling, every which way, but audibly. When Cliff did perchance direct mouth toward microphone, his hand intervened on its way to tousle that mane or shift those specs. At lecture's end, applause was slow in welling up. Cliff stepped away from the podium, Karen will remember, mumbling sotto voce, they didn't like it. Cliff, we whispered, they're still listening, still registering subtle double negatings that dislodge dogmatic theory. As clapping increased, we slipped out for a meal, where as usual, Cliff wouldn't eat salad. So here's the mystery. Despite chronic microphonophobia, Cliff's lectures worldwide, including here at age 76, accepting in Javanese the Bintang Jasa Utama Award, manifestly affected folks even when catching just snatches of utterance, and perhaps in a language they didn't know. Cliff's ineluctably local speaking, at once hoarse and melodious, somehow sank in with diverse audiences urged to engage plural persuasions of a world in pieces during times a-changing. Now, besides deep interpretation and adroit comparison, Cliff did indulge in small talk, notwithstanding his reluctant hellos and unreliable turn-taking. To celebrate this sociable side, I excerpt from letters, often long, we long exchanged, just Cliff's casual news, greetings and sign-offs, knowing nods, and fond nudges. 1982, Professor J. Boone, PhD, etc. Dear Sir, I deeply regret the unusual delay in my response to your letter of January 22nd last, but I have been struck by a small case of leprosy. Seriously, folks, Indonesia was a gas. The combination of rich old American tourists, a German-run liner with Philippines cabin crew, Komodo lizards, Flores head-hunting dances in a sea of mud, and Italian gigolos in bikini swim trunks at the Bali Hyatt bar rather blew the mind. Karen loved it. Me too, in a strange way. Although the blending of things I hate most in the world and those I most love, both les autres, but different sorts, was something of an experience. Indeed, that is what I kept being told by the ineffable leader, that I was not traveling, but having a travel experience. The dragons, a third kind of autre, were the best. They came out of the underbrush in a dry gulch to tear apart goats hung up for them by the forest rangers, live and in color. The very idea of a dominant carnivore, monitor lizard, gives one hope for evolution. 3 talkative pages later, enough already. Best to Olivian and whoever else lives at your house. Karen sends love, me too, Cliff. 5 years before, 1977, Dear Jim, there is apparently a mysterious force that through all creation moves after all, for precisely the day, today, where my guilt index, measured in words of self-castigation, over having not written to you earlier, rose to the point where I was finally going actually to write. I got your most recent letter, and so I'm actually doing what I was finally going actually to do, but probably actually wouldn't have. I'm apologetic about my dilatory nature. I've been going all out to finish the Moroccan souk thing. And 5 years earlier still, Dear Jim, yeah, I know I'm no damn good, but I didn't get back from Morocco to find your long and very nicely typed letter until mid-August, and then went off to Vermont. And then the Institute opened, and besides, I'm no damn good. As I say, I'm getting chapters for our Morocco book on the bazaar. Maybe I'll call it When Communications Collide, and the social history of Safru, or anti-social history, but you can't say that, it's ethnocentric. Basic Books is coming out with my culture papers, and I wrote a theoretical methodological here where, there where introduction. I include it to render you a bit less triste in the tropics. That's what field work in Bali was like in those days. You got sent a typescript of thick description. Some months earlier, Cliff shared headlines from the home front. Otherwise, nothing drastic has occurred here. Wallace won big and Muskie lost big in Florida. Nixon went to China, and so my son has had to memorize the names of Chinese rivers in school, which is a great leap forward of some kind. Cliff then wrote bountiful letters even to someone he didn't know. Me, for instance, in 1968. He, Hilly, Erica, and Ben were tucked into Morocco when I pounced on him from afar, Chicago, for advice about potential fieldwork. His copious response guided us to Indonesia, framed with ironic disclaimers that captured my fancy forever. Long-distance advising, especially of someone you have never met and whose work you have not seen, is a dubious business. But I'll give you, because you asked, my own thoughts, provided you accept them as uninformed, and that if you take them for more than they are worth, which is very little, no tuition funds will be made. Following 4 single-space pages of publishable insights into attractions and perils of North Africa, Java, Bali, and the French colonial expanse, Cliff concluded, well, so much for offhand opinions delivered out of a void into a void. Now I know how people who do blind Rorschach analyses feel. My last bit of advice is don't take my advice too seriously, but keep instead, as they say in the Pentagon, your options open. That was not funny in 1969. So went his reply to the first item I ever wrote to Cliff. Then several long months ago, I was asked to compose about Cliff the item I had hoped never to read. Death Notices, our Anthropological Association newsletter, abruptly calls them. I said I would try, but could I please make it unconventional? The editor agreed. Published in January, here's how the piece ends. At age 74, Cliff began interpretively thinking, as a moral act, toward being survived, offering wonderfully wizened quips about waiting time that can console all who experienced him near. As my friends and co-conspirators age and depart what Stevens called this vast inelegance, and I myself stiffen and grow unsighted, I shall surely be tempted to intervene and set things right yet once more. But that doubtless will prove unavailing and quite possibly comic. Nothing so ill befits a scholarly life, as the struggle not to leave it. But for the moment I am pleased to have been given the chance to contrive my own fable and plead my own case before the necrologists get at me. No one should take what I have been doing here as anything more than that. It felt intensely fitting to quote Cliff at the end of his own obituary, a genre blurred, I believe, by his work's lasting resonance. Cliff's clauses. The way that fellow wrote tempts one toward interpreting and remembering like a gamelan sounds. Available light. Geertzian. Gong.
Clifford Geertz has died. I miss him terribly, his conversation and his laughter. The evening he and our son, Sam, then 6, joyously talked about baseball cards as they went through them, one by one. The evening I spoke of my deep bereavement, and he listened with sensitivity, insight, and an open heart. I am far from alone in sorely missing his presence and his writings. I think first of Karen, Erica, Ben, and Hilly. Of those of us here, the usual suspects, among others, and finally of folks in unexpected places, such as the San Francisco Experimental Theater Ensemble that aspires to engage and to reflect its racially and culturally diverse audiences. Thick House is the name of its venue, and the ensemble calls itself Thick Description, the title of Geertz's classic essay on interpretive method. Geertz's writings are a garden of readerly delight. They embody grace and beauty. It is as if they were gifts given to the peruser of his texts. The movement of his essays never ceases, shifting as it does from one vantage point to another, now with irony, now chuckles, now trenchant critique, now a clear stand, turning issues over and over, inspecting them from diverse angles, making their complexity not simple but intelligible. For Geertz, style is substance, a way of engaging the world and making present what his ethnography is most centrally about, whether it is art, ritual, everyday life, the business of making a living, the state as theater, or brutal political killings. His finely crafted prose is an aesthetic designed not to distance, but to bring readers close to the hard surfaces of social reality. A remarkable humorist, Geertz was a wit for our times. His essays are laced with irony, not meant to be subjected to a literal reading. Earnest readers, inclined to flatten curvilinear texts, would most probably not have noticed that Geertz is really funny. When he notes, to pick an example more or less at random, that cultural differences on our planet are growing less extreme, less clearly marked than they once were, the good old days, he says, of widow burning and cannibalism are gone forever. That's what I thought about slavery, too. Then he adds that, nonetheless, significant differences will remain. I quote, "The French will never eat salted butter." Glad we get it. The subtitle of his book, After the Fact, itself a pun, is a double entendre. 2 countries, 4 decades, 1 anthropologist, 2, 4, 1. Such a bargain. When he depicts himself about to embark on a college career at the age of 20, he says of his former self, "I wanted to be a novelist, preferably famous." Readers would be well advised to take their time, relax, and enjoy. He was a cultural but not an ethical relativist, though he never would have put this complex matter so flatly. The notion of cultural relativism he would hold is the fairly modest doctrine that simply because a culture or individuals are different, it does not follow that they are demented, dangerous, stupid, or pathological. They could simply be different, living their lives as they do, with distinctive assumptions that may be rendered intelligible in their own context. His most explicit essay on cultural relativism has a characteristically ironic title, Anti-Relativism. He means that he's against thinkers who categorically reject relativism. In the first place, their notion of relativism is almost always wildly mistaken. He does not want to get caught in the position of having to defend ideas that he never held in the first place, ideas that in fact he disagrees with. Why do battle with somebody else's straw man? Moreover, cultural relativism does not either imply nor lead to ethical relativism, that alleged slippery slope where anything goes, and before you know it, they'll be doing it in the street. Quite the contrary. When different peoples, however defined, bump up against one another, they tend to maintain, even as they put in jeopardy, not only their cultural but also their ethical assumptions. Engaging with other cultural worlds does not mean that one loses one's own ethical bearings. The point for Geertz is to engage with cultural and ethical differences. It is only by knowing the actual variations, historical and cultural, in human forms of life, each in their full singularity, that one can educate, as Geertz did so astonishingly, one's capacity to imagine the possible forms of human life. He often conceives such encounters as a dialogue, meant both figuratively and literally. After speaking, for example, of the need to create conversations across social boundaries, such as, he says, ethnicity, religion, class, gender, language, race, he addressed the necessity, in his words, and I give him the last words, to enlarge the possibility of intelligible discourse between people quite different from one another in interest, outlook, wealth, and power, and yet contained in a world where, tumbled as they are in endless connection, it is increasingly difficult to get out of each other's way.
I think I'm speaking on behalf of countless others in the world who enormously benefited from what Cliff has said. It's a great honor for me to be able to speak here, but I wish this moment had not come. I first met him in 1984 when he visited my country in a scholarly exchange program. Japan is, of course, Ruth Benedict's country, and in the analysis of her text, Cliff wrote as follows, quote, "Japan has been for us more absolutely otherwise, an enormous something, trim, intricate, and madly busy, that fails to compute. The country, the only real place that appears as more than a reference point in Gulliver's Travels, has looked not just distant, but off the map, a funny place," close quote. He visited this Gulliver's country off the map, and Cliff, Karen, my wife Cheiko, and I happened to travel together for about a week to an island called Shikoku. I saw him several years before when I was a graduate student at Stanford, but this trip in '84 was the first occasion in which I knew him well. He was warm and thoughtful, sincere and humorous, and insightful to the extreme. Our trip was wonderful, full of wonders of traditional and hybrid cultures. But it was tough because the trip was so densely scheduled. We rented a car and drove it every day through the mountains just for successive appointments, which were already set up in every town we had to visit. I think Cliff and Karen learned how madly busy this place was, and I just hope that our hardship became funny and fond memories in time. Cliff's second visit was in 1992, this time to receive Fukuoka Asian Culture Prize. His acceptance speech, published only in my country, was a real gem, delivered in an unassuming attitude characteristic of him. Quote, "Much of the excitement of studying Asian culture and society comes from knowing that whatever you think you know will very soon stand in need of correction and revision. I consider myself to have been unaccountably blessed to have been allowed by whomever it is who allows such things to spend much of my adult life in Asia, trying to understand Asia, trying to communicate that understanding to others, and trying to come to terms with the fact that whatever understanding I may have achieved is fragile and temporary, a mere skittering across the surface of matters so deep and intricate as to escape all categories and defeat all theories." Close quote. Skittering across the surface of matters is, of course, an understatement. He continued, "There are not many people so fortunate as to have their works so intensely shape the inner formation of their lives as mine has shaped mine. To receive a prize for having been thus blessed is an astonishing thing." He was genuinely grateful. In 1995, he revisited Japan and participated in a forum. Then he delivered what later became part of his Available Light, his last book. In the evening of the forum, we four had dinner together. He told me that it was the high point of the trip. We talked a lot about us, about the world, about his writing, and about anthropology. He repeatedly told me, "Anthropology is interesting." I remember his face was flushed with excitement. Cliff had a clear identity as an anthropologist, and at the same time avoided to be immersed in anthropology. He said that he was among anthropologists only for 2 years, only at Berkeley in the late 50s, half of the time actually being spent at behavioral sciences in Palo Alto. In other times, he was in the Department of Social Relations, the Committee for the Comparative Study of New Nations, the School of Social Science, and so on. Being an anthropologist and being outside of anthropology was most characteristic of him. Perhaps that was the most anthropological about him. He repeated his excitement about anthropology in the closing remark of the After the Fact, a complex book only partially autobiographical, quoting an Indian story about a sage who claims this is not an elephant in front of a real elephant, and after examining the footprints of the departed elephant, declares an elephant was here. Cliff wrote, quote, "For me at least, anthropology is like that, trying to reconstruct elusive, rather ethereal, and by now wholly departed elephants from the footprints they have left on my mind. There's not much assurance or sense of closure, not even much of a sense of knowing what it is one precisely is after in so indefinite a quest amid such various people over such a diversity of times. But it is an excellent way, interesting, dismaying, useful, and amusing to expend a life." Close quote. I'm glad he expended his life that way. I'm most grateful and feel lucky that he tried to communicate what he claimed to be his fragile and temporary understanding in that amazingly succinct, impossibly convoluted, accurately ambiguous, and beautifully multi-layered prose.
I'm going to start out with a quote, but then I'm going to show some pictures. The quote is from the introduction to Works and Lives. Within anthropology, it is hard to deny the fact that some individuals set the terms of discourse in which others thereafter move, for a while anyway, and in their own manner. Our whole subject is differentiated once one looks past the conventional rubrics of academic life in such terms. Boas, Benedict, Malinowski point not just to our particular works, but to whole ways of going at things anthropological. They mark off the intellectual landscape, differentiate the discourse field. That is why we tend to discard their first names after a while and adjectivize their last ones, Boasian or Grioliste, or, of course, what he never says, Geertzian. And these are just personal photographs, and I think if there's a kind of theme to my talk, it's about his generosity. This is from 1965, when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. I was originally assigned to David Schneider as an advisor. It was a very bad fit, and I was miserable, but I was too scared to break it off and change advisors. I lucked out when Schneider took a sabbatical to finish writing American Kinship and sent letters to all his advisees telling us to get new advisors. I learned later that some of his students begged him to keep them on, and he did, not me. I wrote to Cliff in Morocco, asking if he would take me on as an advisee, and he agreed. This was the first of many times he saved my life. That's same time with Noor Yalman, in case some of you recognize him. As I have written elsewhere, he was a wonderful advisor. The main thing was, he actually seemed to take me seriously. It is hard to capture the pervasiveness of a kind of low-level sexism in the Chicago anthropology department at the time. And I don't like to sound too whiny about such things, but really it was very bad in the mid-60s. Cliff, however, seemed willing to accept the idea that girls might have something to say. At the Institute, 1973. I knew Cliff had an assistantship which he could bestow on people without their going through the application process. I was desperate to start my first book, but was teaching a heavy load at Sarah Lawrence College. I asked Cliff very diffidently about the assistantship, and he said, "Oh, you've got some publications." I had like 2. "You should have a fellowship." And he saved my life. Again. Same year. I don't have to tell the people in this room what a gift a year at the Institute was and is. I really don't think I would have had the same career if I didn't have that year and another one further down the line, not only to do my own work, but to hang out with such incredibly smart and serious and intense people, and with Cliff. This is in Fez, Morocco, in 1986. Cliff, me, Marshall Solins, Edmund Leach. It was sort of a roll call of the immortals, Jim Boone, and more. I could go through the whole picture, but I won't. Emiko Onuki Tierney organized a Wennergren conference called Culture Through Time to be held in Fez, Morocco. It was a star-studded affair. There was one day off for sightseeing in the middle of the week, and Cliff offered to take a bunch of us to see the town of Sefru, where he was then engaged in field work. Paul Rabineau, Jim Clifford, Jim Boone, Cliff, Karen, and me behind the camera. We set off in a little caravan of 2 cars on a gorgeous sunny day. Here's the group, minus me taking the picture on the terrace of a restaurant overlooking Safru. Unfortunately, when we rejoined the seminar table the next morning, one of the big men at the conference, I won't name names, was in a snit. He was already miffed that the conference was loaded in favor of what he called Cliff's équipe. The fact that we had all decamped on the day off was the last straw. It made it seem like the real party had gone elsewhere and he and the others were left behind. The atmosphere from then on was quite tense, but it couldn't spoil the pleasure of that glorious day in Safru. Oops. And that's also in front of the restaurant. Just a few more quickly without much commentary. This is 1990, back at the Institute. I was back at the Institute as a visiting fellow, starting the New Jersey Dreaming Project. Since I was changing areas from Nepal to Newark, I had to almost completely retrain, from the sublime to the ridiculous. I had to almost completely retrain myself. This was another year that saved my life. 1995, the review of the department, the review of the School of Social Sciences. I was on the review committee, and some others who are here were on that committee, headed by the formidable Hannah Holborn Gray. Everyone looks cheerier in this picture than I think they felt. There's another one, Joan. And then 2000, Cliff's retirement party. And this is the last picture I have of him in Berlin after participating in Stephen Greenblatt's seminar at the Wissenschaftskolleg in 2004. And it is my last picture, but I did see Cliff one more time later in 2004. My husband and I had a summer place on the Jersey Shore, and Cliff and Karen came to visit. We had a lovely day walking along the boardwalk in the sun and salt air. Cliff sat down on a bench facing the ocean, looking very relaxed and happy, and said how nice it would be to just sit there and read. Unfortunately, I didn't take a picture, but I miss him very much.
They come back to us, those phrases, those words, arriving, unbidden, an old friend met by surprise. He said of some lives that they are a struggle for the real. He said, it is not always a matter of what to believe, but how to believe it. He captured a career in a phrase when he said of our work in Morocco that we had to become parochial in order to become cosmopolitan. He said, there is no assent to truth without descent to cases. He enfolded others in a phrase, speaking of their moral vividness, their settled haze of ceremony, and he wasn't afraid to chide others for their solemn self-deception, their perfected air of contemptuous resignation. He could, without rancor, depict a critic as a cultural game warden, the accusation of relativism as the favorite execration of the entrenched, or the overwrought defenders of a discipline as jealous always of their origin myths. He could tease himself by characterizing the anthropologist as a manic tinkerer adrift with his wits. He could say of his own style that at least it's better to be over the top than under the heap. And when he asked me to join him his first year here, he wrote to say, "So, we're on our way to the Institute, Rudy toot toot." He knew how to tease a newly minted PhD when he leaned over to me at lunch after the defense of my dissertation and said, "I have only one piece of advice for you as you begin your academic career." And I listened very carefully, and he said, "Never give a student a C+, they'll just bang on your door trying to get it raised to a B-." The words fly up like startled birds, like bats in a cave, the very image he commended by reciting the words of Richard Wilbur, "The mind is like a bat, precisely, save that in the happiest intellection, a graceful error may correct the cave." The story is told of a wealthy American businessman who was traveling once in Europe when he heard about a wondrous castle in which, if you stood in just the right spot, you could utter a sound and hear it echo numerous times. He found the castle, heard the echoes, and immediately bought the castle, had it dismantled, shipped to America, and precisely reconstructed here. But when everything was complete, the echo was not there. The measurements were verified, the location of each original item confirmed, but the echo was not there. One evening, a young architect who had been working on the project walked alone throughout the castle. After a time, he paused, looked around, and began to make some changes. He threw open shutters and rearranged furniture. He rehung tapestries, moved pictures and artifacts. Through the night he worked, and when in the loom of dawn, when everything seemed to him to be just right, he uttered a sound, and the echo had returned. Cliff never asked us to live within his words, and though they will always rise to us on their own, joining us at the seminar table, streaming through our thoughts, they will be accompanied by his reminder in those words he liked to quote, that it's bad poets who borrow and good ones who steal. And it may be there, in that prompting of our voices, in that purloining of his own, that many of us may come as close as we may ever hope to having experienced a genuine blessing.
Well, I've been greatly moved by this wonderful series of tributes in music as well as in words. And at this late stage in the afternoon, it's very hard to add to them in any significant way. But perhaps I can hope to offer you something, and if this is so, it is because among those who have been sharing their fond and loving as well as admiring recollections of Cliff this afternoon, I turn out to be the only one who has travelled from that part of the world memorably characterized by recent American statesmen as Old Europe. During my own third year here at the Institute, Cliff was preparing himself to spend a year in that veritable bastion of Old Europe, the University of Oxford, where he was, I may say, an outstanding and outstandingly popular Eastman professor in the academic year 1978-9. Cliff and I had several conversations about his impending visit, largely because it turned out to pose a not inconsiderable ethnographic challenge. And the main problem was that Cliff could not get the university to tell him what they expected of him. To cite a phrase he liked, "What's the deal?" We heard him asking on the video earlier, didn't we? What the hell is going on with these people? And that's certainly what he began to ask. At one stage, I suggested that he might bypass the university authorities and write directly to the college where he was going to be a fellow, Balliol College, and ask them what they were hoping for. I think we were both a bit stunned by the reply he received from the master of Balliol, the philosopher Tony Kenny, which Cliff showed me and which I believe I can remember word for word. It simply read, "Dear Professor Geertz, we consider you to be a star, so what we are hoping for is that you will glitter." That didn't help. And in any case, as has been beautifully brought out this afternoon, Cliff didn't really like to be considered a star. Finally, Cliff told me this in some triumph. He hit on an ingenious solution. He sent a letter to the university administration in which he simply said, "Do you think there may be anything you have forgotten to tell me?" He showed me the chastened response that he immediately received from Oxford. This said the university was extremely grateful for his reminder and that it was indeed true that they had forgotten something, and that was, of course, that Cliff would need to ensure that his BA was incorporated as an Oxford degree. Well, I felt fairly embarrassed by all of this. It's extremely easy for people from Cambridge to be embarrassed by the University of Oxford. But what struck me most was not just Cliff's tolerance of all of this, but the fact that he really liked these letters. He really enjoyed them. And the reason for that, I eventually came to see lay deep in his character, and thus deep in his academic personality. One of the things that Cliff most relished, I think, as he surveyed the world from China to Peru was the range of things that other people believe and do that would strike you or me as extremely odd, but which seemed to them to be models of rationality. As early as 1966, there's an essay of Cliff's in which he concludes, and I quote, "It may be in the cultural particularities of people, and especially in their oddities, that some of the most instructive revelations of what it is to be generically human are to be found." Cliff loved the puzzles that such oddities set, and he deservedly became world famous for his commentaries on them. But he also loved, and I sometimes think that he loved this above all, the unconscious humor that so frequently abounds in our efforts to interact with each other. And although I think of Cliff as a basically melancholy person, what I chiefly remember from my conversations with him and my years as a colleague was that we were endlessly laughing. In After the Fact, Cliff summarized his life in anthropology in 4 adjectives. 2 are rather obvious, that the vocation seemed to him interesting and useful. But the other 2 are, I think, deeply revealing, that he had found it at once dismaying and amusing. Mainly, of course, it was North Africa and Indonesia that gave him the opportunity to observe strangenesses and to hone his incomparable skills at interpreting them. But I like to think that a little may have been contributed by old Europe as well.
I think we are all convinced that Cliff was a fantastic scholar and a formidable intellectual, and if you're not convinced by now, well, we're nearing the end. What I'd like to do, for my part, is to pay tribute to Cliff as a teacher. We taught together off and on for 25 years. It began, as well as I can remember, roughly in, I think it was 1974, I ran into Cliff and he said, "What are you up to at the university on the other side of the railroad tracks?" I said, "I'm teaching a course, an undergraduate seminar on the history of mentalities." "What's that?" he said. Well, I tried to explain that it was the latest thing off the left bank, that Histoire des Mentalités is an attempt to understand the worldview of ordinary people, the value systems that they spin out of their own cultures. And as I was droning on and on, he stopped me and he said, "That sounds like anthropology." Well, a year or 2 later, we were teaching the course together, History 406, History of Mentalities, but in fact it became a course on history and anthropology. Now, you might think, especially after the wonderful interview with Cliff, that he was not a born teacher. He wasn't. He always arrived first in the classroom in East Pine Hall on the Princeton campus. In fact, he always arrived early for everything, whether a dinner party or a train departure. He would sit there saying nothing and scratching himself. You saw it happening in the interview. He had no small talk. He would sit there silently, this wonderful mane of hair falling off this large forehead, as if to say, "Beware, genius inside." And he was ungainly in his chair. He always had a jacket that was too tight over his pot belly. And the students were rather frightened of him, as I think most people were, in fact.
So my job was to sort of soften things up, to get the discussion going, which wasn't easy because, as I say, Cliff had no small talk. He just sat there, frightening everyone, until occasionally there would be an explosion. It's hard to describe these moments, but they were pedagogically, I think, among the greatest moments I've ever experienced. I'll just give you one example. We'd been reading that week a very wonderful but very difficult ethnographic study of the Tewa Indians in New Mexico. It's by Alfonso Ortiz. And I tried to get the discussion going by, laying out Ortiz's argument, the coordinates of space with mythology and so on. And by the time I got to initiation rites, I realized that it was a bomb. I mean, everything was just flat and boring and unreal. You maybe got the words right, but certainly you didn't get the music. And at that moment, Cliff exploded. He said, the initiation rite, think of what it meant to these young Tewa adolescents. They're asleep, they're woken up in the middle of the night, they are dressed in only a loincloth. It's cold, a blanket is put over them. They climb down several ladders to the deepest kiva in the most sacred and secret part of the pueblo. And there they stand, huddled together, shivering, when there's a big bang on the floor above them. A blanket is placed in front of the ladder, and when the blanket is removed by the assistants, they see the supreme god of their clan, or moiety. He's wearing a hideous, frightening mask, and he says to them, are you ready to become men, to be finished? Well, they say yes. Take off your blankets. So they're standing there, shivering. He pulls out a whip and starts whipping them, one after the other, fiercely, really hurting them, raising big welts on their body, and when at last they're ready to drop, he stops, and he removes his mask. What they see is one of the tribal elders who had been walking around the pueblo every day, let's say Uncle Alfonso. Now, Cliff asked, what was going on? It's the same question that Quentin mentioned. What the hell is happening here? Well, what I thought was the same as what the students thought. The initiated youth discovered that it was a confidence game, that in fact the god was just Uncle Alfonso. No, said Cliff. They discovered that Uncle Alfonso was a god. It was one of those moments when you suddenly looked into a new landscape. Cliff had a way of cracking open alien ways of thinking and getting inside a foreign mental world, even sometimes in the classroom, taking you by the hand and leading you around in that foreign territory. Well, there have been a lot of great teachers in East Pine, but Cliff was one of them.
On behalf of Cliff's family, Erica Geertz Redding and her husband Frank, Benjamin Geertz and his wife Linda Lee Stokes, his granddaughters Andrea and Elena Martinez, and Hildred Geertz, his first wife, and on my own behalf, I'm Karen Blue, his second wife. I want to thank you all for being here today. You console us and the Institute community with your presence. You do Cliff honor. When he was in the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania toward the end of his tortured, nearly 3-month stay, the doctors had said that he might, in time, actually recover enough to come home and go to his office again. Cliff, ever the skeptic, as you've been hearing, was not convinced. In trying to find a way to encourage him, I asked him what, for him, would be the one most important thing required for a man who had been battered repeatedly, his much there. He thought about it for a while, and then he said, talking to people. It's a theme you've been hearing about. And perhaps that gives you some idea of the value he placed on your conversations with him. He was not always an easy man to talk to, but good talk was the thing he valued most. Then I asked what else he would want in life, what was next on his list. And very quickly he said reading and then writing. These things, conversations about matters of substance, reading, thinking, and writing about them, are what the Institute uniquely nurtures and enables. This extraordinary place, the Institute for Advanced Study, was home to Cliff for the greatest part of his fully fledged intellectual life, for 36 years. Many of you you've heard Bob, and many of you will have read his affectionate piece in the New York Review of Books, in which he mentions Cliff's often rumpled clothing, and he might have added his overstuffed pockets. Cliff did often look as if he didn't care about how he looked, which sometimes I think served as a pretty good disguise. He didn't look like an institution builder, which may have helped him in his efforts to construct and strengthen the School of Social Science, initiated at the Institute by Carl Kazin, whom we've the good fortune to have with us today, and the then trustees. Although I think, Jim Wolfensohn, you were not a trustee then. No, not yet. But the trustees are, and continue to be, and the chairman of the trustees it's a crucial matter for us all, those of us who are part of the Institute community and the wider intellectual world. For someone whose appearance suggested a distracted ivory towerish don, he had a surprisingly down-to-earth and highly focused ideas about how research institutions might achieve their goals. We've learned this from some unpublished materials that have come to light since Cliff's death. He worked harder than he appeared to at ensuring the success of the School of Social Science at the Institute. Along the way, he accumulated colleagues in the school who became real friends with whom he could talk, friends who, with their families, offered vital support in hard times. Professors Albert Hirschman, Michael Walzer, Joan Scott, and Eric Maskin. Cliff was surrounded by the best staff imaginable, including his secretary of 33 years, Amy Jackson, the only person who can reliably read Cliff's handwriting, and school administrator extraordinaire, Donna Petito, who, together with his school colleague, Professor Joan Scott, and Director Peter Goddard and his office, have orchestrated this day so gracefully. The Institute looks after the whole talking, thinking, reading, and writing person. Wonder of wonders, Cliff ate supremely well every workday, and I don't mean at home. Thanks in these last years to Chef Michel Raymond and his dining hall team. From time to time, Cliff imbibed uplifting spirits in Harry's bar. Although he didn't mention marvelous food, good wine, and good scotch, or fine jackets on his list of the most important things in life, these were all sources of real and great pleasure for him. Cliff developed a passion for fine Italian jackets during a lecture trip to Italy, a passion pursued later in New York. I used to get annoyed with saving his best jackets, but his view was, if you've got it, wear it. And much mended in lining would finally become a stand, whereupon out it went. Now I think he got every possible ounce of enjoyment from those jackets. I'm just sorry he's not here to wear out any more of them. Cliff said he had a lucky life. The Institute has been a great part of his luck and mine.
It's my job to bring this remembrance to a close. We're going to have some more music as we end. And it's my job to give thanks to Cliff above all for all the reasons you've heard today, to those of you who spoke so lovingly and warmly of him, and some of you came from very far away to do that, to Mr. Harjito and the gamelan players who have played so beautifully for us, and to all of you who've joined us today. I now invite you to adjourn to the dining hall for a reception and to continue the good talk we've had here. I want to remind you to sign the remembrance book if you haven't done it on the way in. It will be in the dining hall for you to sign there. And I want to ask the speakers to remain for a mandatory photograph. And everybody else can now adjourn. Thank you all very much for coming.